So you wrote that there's one sales practice that everyone uses, but few master. What is it, and how can every rep watching this apply it?
Asking thoughtful discovery questions. Like every seller knows you have to do discovery, you have to ask questions. However, there is a very wide gap between a question that leads to a meaningful conversation and just like the typical same old, like I'm gonna go through the checklist type approach. And the way that I think about it is first you have to have in mind a framework of what you want to move toward in your understanding with the buyer. And so like the way that I think about it is like, I really want to go deep on the journey that the buyer is on today, that they've decided for themselves to take. So where are they? What's not working? Why does that truly matter to them? Is it getting worse, or is it going to work itself out over time? How do they think about it in a way that others don't? What maybe do they feel misunderstood that they see about the current issue or scenario that others have missed? And then I want to understand like, well, where are they trying to go? Right? Like if this is where they are today, where do they want to go tomorrow? So from some type of problem to some type of payoff. And I want to understand like, what would it look and feel like to like step into that for a second? Like if I can use a question to help create a clear visual of like, well, how do we know we're there? And how big of a change is it going to be to go from here to there? And then we're going to look at, well, okay, like, well, what's the pathway to get there? And this is where you start to kind of think more process questions, like who needs to come along for the ride? What have you tried before that maybe went off the rails and took you off the path? Maybe that was a little like, had some anxiety and some fear baked into it. And is there going to be a point where we know we're going to hit friction on the path? Like all topics that you can uncover with good questions. And then the very last thing that I would say is like, discovery is ultimately helping the buyer think for themselves on an old topic in a new way by asking a question. And that's where you can break down so much resistance inside of a deal, not by like making a statement or telling you something, but just by helping you come to that conclusion on your own. It's like that saying, anybody convinced against their will is of the same opinion still. Like that's where a good question comes in.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. We've talked a lot about putting the problem on paper, you know? So team training and actually like developing sellers in this way is pretty rare in my experience. We don't spend a ton of time on it. But what can sales managers do to help reps actually master the art of crafting a narrative?
Yeah, so the first thing that I would do, because you're right, by the way, like it is underdeveloped, it's an undertrained skill. And I think just like the way that a lot of sellers see themselves is more like I'm a conversationalist, I'm not necessarily a content creator or writer, right? So this whole idea of crafting narratives with the buying team is a little foreign. I would start with something that is familiar, not foreign. And that is your own pipeline, your own work week. And so I would have reps write out a weekly pipeline update to unpack like what's in the pipeline, how does that compare to, you know, what needs to come in, top priorities for the week, blockers in the way, and just like write down what you already know. And part of the goal there is like one, to ease into the discipline, but to show like, hey, you'll probably uncover new things that you didn't even know you were thinking about, or gaps of like, oh yeah, I guess that is a blocker. Like I need to like make a request for this or talk about this, right? So just say like, hey, it's worth it because you will uncover new things in the writing process. Next thing that I would do is I would have like a follow-up email. You could take a business case, executive summary, whatever it is, and then give it to another peer on the team and then have them work with each other to say, hey, you lost me here. I would rewrite it this way and then go peer-to-peer feedback, because it is always easier to like point out something that is unclear or you don't like in somebody else's writing than it is for you to necessarily like evaluate and improve your own writing.
Yeah.
So work on rewrites for other people. And then third, we'll go back to your point in the last episode around conversations. Just go back and listen to what your buyers are saying, write with their words. So now you've moved into producing something new with the buying team. Take a framework as a starting point, listen to their language, and then it's kind of like, did you ever play Mad Libs?
Oh yeah. Totally.
Okay, so think of it as like writing at first is like Mad Libs.
Yeah.
Here's the like skeleton or the storyline, the framework.
Yep.
Now let's use the buyer's language to plug it in. there you go.
So this actually brings me into something that's in your book where you talk about groups of people using Legos and 2 people trying to build a very specific thing versus 4. And many sellers have to navigate the dysfunctional buying groups. What steps can closers take to accelerate and negotiate when you have so many different personalities, when they're all trying to build something with these Legos, but it's, a growing monumental challenge?
Yeah, so the study that you're mentioning came out of UCLA, where it was a group of Legos that was placed into different teams, different sizes, to say like who could build the structure the fastest. And the smaller teams did, because they were able to, they cut down all of the communication overhead, the different opinions, the back and forth, and they just built. So the idea is like when you're working with a large buying group, and this is where like the multi-threading advice sometimes goes wrong, is like more people is definitely not always better, because you're going to get into very unproductive conversations.
Yeah.
So I would start there and I would say, who do I need to be at the table? If I go back to past deals that have closed, what were the contacts that were present in the deal? Who swung or influenced the deal significantly? And at what stage or point did they come into the cycle? And I would go back and I would say, okay, do we have the right people and no more? And then I would say, inside of that, can we find one kind of lead who's going to be your champion?
Yep.
To coordinate and to like call out the disagreement into the open. But at the same time, it's going to be that like type of person in the group where like if you put out a group, have you ever been on a group demo? You like
one too many times.
You put a question out there and like it's just like nobody's answering until one person steps in. Because a lot of times like we'll wait for that person who holds the weight of the group to speak. So before going to the group, can you have a one-on-one conversation with that one person who's going to turn heads and people take their cues from them? And then thirdly, the last thing that I would say is like, we're going to tie this all the way back. If you can't in writing get to consensus on what you're actually trying to solve, then any conversation downstream on product requirements, criteria, differentiators, alternative solutions, it's not going to be productive.
You and I have talked a little bit about buyers and their own like personal motivations. How can a seller determine if a buyer has those 3 eyes that we've talked about, if they have the information, if they have the influence, and or they're just trying to feel like they're doing something? So
one thing that you might bring up in a conversation is like, let's say you were just talking about a like project plan, mutual action plan, and you're going through all the steps. I might be like, hey, this is going to be like a lot of work, and it's going to like take some time away from your day job, and yet you are signing yourself up for this when nobody else is jumping to. Like, I'm just interested to understand like what's driving you to say, let's do this together. And then you start to kind of unpack it a little bit more and more. And I'll give you an example of this. So I was talking with one who is now a customer, but I asked him, I was like, hey man, this is gonna be like a change for your team. Are you sure you're gonna be, up to do this? And he started to tell me how they're expecting their 3rd son, joining the family soon. And he's like, I need to get to my team's number faster than like we have in the past, because I don't wanna be on at 9 p.m. again, looking at another material from somebody. Like, I got to be ready for the night shift if like the little one is fussy and my wife is like, I'm going to bed here. And so he was talking about, for him, like his ability to become more present as a father and a father of 3 that was changing. Like for him, that due date.
It's the compelling event.
That was the compelling event, right?
Yeah.
It's like no other thing that I try to create or replicate could ever drive that amount of urgency and incentive for him. He's like, man, to know that with pipeline as it is, if we can win more deals and we can do that in a clear way, and I know, like I can feel that sense of calm in the office, I'm gonna be more like just the time, but also mentally present at home.
And you could quantify as much value as you want on the business side, but there's no way you could quantify the value of being able to be present with your family.
Yeah, like I can help him put numbers on it for finance.
Totally.
But that's not something
that's not his personal motivation.
Yeah, exactly.
That makes a ton of sense. So Nate, your book, Selling With, highlights that 92% of deals don't have a business case attached to them. If 92% of sellers don't do it, then why should sellers spend their time creating one?
Yeah, so I think it's a totally like fair question. First, I'll just level set on like what is a business case? Because a lot of people, they hear business case and they think like ROI calculator, financial model. And when I'm talking about a business case, I'm talking about a written narrative that connects your deal back into the executive priority, and it creates the context or the narrative that brings meaning to those numbers. So it's not that there aren't numbers, there are for sure, but it's, think about it, a crisp, clear, one-page written narrative about what the deal actually is that was built with the buying team.
So not a 30-page slide deck.
Yes, not a 30-page slide deck. Yes, that's right. So in other words, it's more of the process of how the deal develops from like, what are you finding early in discovery, framing up with the problem statements, and then doing this over time with the buying team. Said differently, 8% of deals have a business case. And the gap between those that have and don't have a business case is massive, like 12% versus 64% win rates. 112 days in the sales cycle versus 150 days in the sales cycle. So the question is like, once sellers begin to see that data, then what are they doing? Because a lot of people, they just haven't seen like, wow, this is the way that this can literally transform the way that we go to market and interact with the buying team. And so a lot of them, again, you go back to where we started, rewriting the job description of a seller. It just doesn't fit with the mental model of, well, it's my message in sales meetings where I'm going to convince or influence the deal. And they're not realizing like, oh my gosh, I need to create the content to guide the internal buying conversation when I can't be there. That's how the deal gets done. So until you begin to think about the deals in that way, you're not going to say, well, let me spend the time to build out that business case as we defined it earlier.
Yep, 100%.